colors.
Got it, got it.
Yeah.
Cool, cool. Well, he'll be here soon. We're excited.
Okay,
Here,
cool.
we have also a subcommittee staff, which you probably know, ran by Joe Cole.
Yeah, he went through DRC. I came up and briefed him some amount of time ago.
So I'm in the first office now. Yeah, there are. I'm sure exactly what was.
So under Robert's rules, what do you have available
Yeah, we're excited.
to that evening to be able to either hold a vote or to be able to drive it forward?
Okay.
Let's just, our meeting could be over
Okay.
instead of the office.
Okay. Cool. Good to see you, man.
Same.
All right.
You asked Chairman McCall about red wine and that instrument.
Any particular red wine?
He has a favorite, I forgot what it is. You can't run.
No.
Just like, let's.
No, we have rules about how we deal with solicitors.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm waiting for Chris and Chelsea, so I'm not there. I just told him.
Like
Okay. He's a big reader.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, well, I was there for a little while from 2009
talk, right?
Play out.
Witness mic 1, 2, 3. Panel mic 1, 2, 3.
The Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to examine China's strategic aims in Africa and how the U.S. can provide a positive set of alternative options that advance interests of Africans and Americans alike. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Deputy Assistant Secretary Amy Holdman, Deputy Assistant Secretary Rick Waters, and Deputy Assistant Administrator Janine Davis. It is my pleasure to welcome you before the Subcommittee on Africa for this hearing that follows the full committee hearing on the Chinese Communist Party that took place on February 28th. I want to begin by asking for a moment of silence for the World Food Program staff who were killed in the fighting in Sudan. Thank you. But we can do much more than moments of silence, and we intend to. Civilians must be protected, and I reiterate the call for humanitarian ceasefire. The renewed conflict serves as a stark reminder that this administration has a responsibility to take tangible action to address terrorism and threats to peace that can metastasize and spread to our shores. As China seeks to define a future for Africa in its authoritarian image, the United States must stand for principles of freedom and the rule of law. China aims to become the preeminent economic and military power in the world by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. But thanks to America's decades of foreign policy failures, they're ahead of schedule, I fear. President George W. Bush started 2 wars, one of which violated territorial sovereignty, both of which lasted 2 decades. President Obama was a deportations and drone king. President Trump's shithole countries comment caused unnecessary tension. And now Joe Biden has defined his administration with a finger-wagging foreign policy that's made a mockery of the United States on the world stage. It is the role of Congress to hold the administration accountable, each administration, to the American people. But in the 118th Congress, it is my role to start with the Biden administration. We must ask the hard questions that will lead us to more friends, stronger alliances, and mutually beneficial future. The 21st century has been characterized by foreign policy blunders that China has capitalized on, and we cannot mend the errors of the past. But we can use our influence as a legislative body to hold the current administration accountable. This hearing serves to consider how Africa views China, and how to effectively employ soft power, like U.S. technology and foreign direct investment to win over key partners. There are fundamental human rights, corruption, and predatory elements that plague the continent. These are real and substantive issues that we need to deal with. There is also opportunity to identify successful partners and to deploy U.S. diplomatic development and global leadership to advance U.S. strategic interests and ensure the mutual benefit of African nations. The ambitions of the CCP has for Africa are the ambitions they've had for the United States. It's crucial we nip them in the bud, but again, we need friends. That is why, in a world where America is no longer the only choice, we must return to being the most desirable. We must, as Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. It is in our vital national interest to ensure that when nations have a choice between America and China, they choose America first. Beijing has consistently prioritized the African continent and assigns it as a central role in its foreign policy. China's foreign ministers have chosen African countries as their first overseas trips each year since 1991, and Xi Jinping has visited the continent 4 times, most recently in 2018. More must be done by the executive to consistently engage African leaders at the highest levels of our government. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African, making the continent home to an enormous economic and manufacturing potential. However, currently, Chinese companies operate near monopolies in a litany of critical sectors while committing flagrant human rights violations. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a country with over 2/3 of the world's cobalt deposits, CCP-linked companies own 15 of the 19 cobalt-producing mines. This provides Beijing with control over a supply chain crucial for our economic and national security. Ensuring that Chinese companies do not monopolize these markets and encouraging and incentivize two-way U.S. trade and investment with Africa is a key priority of mine. Too often in my conversations with our African partners, I'm told they have had no choice but to accept Chinese bids for contracts and concessions because there was no viable American option. The U.S. government must be more proactive in coming up with measures to unleash the power of the U.S. private sector. I was very glad to see Chairman McCall introduce the Prosper Africa Act last Congress on this issue. And I look forward to working with Chairman McCall and anyone else in furthering this initiative. Similarly, the African Growth Opportunity Act, AGOA, a trade preference agreement with African countries, is up for reauthorization in 2025. As the Subcommittee on Africa, it is our responsibility to investigate ways to increase the effectiveness of this program, and I look forward to hearing you discuss how your institutions are utilizing AGOA to further our bilateral relations around the continent. As our African partners move away from Western colonialism, they must know that they have our full support as partners. It is essential that we aid their self-sufficiency and trade efforts. Chinese military activity in Africa has increased significantly in the last decade. In addition to serving as the largest troop provider to peacekeeping operations in Africa, China employs thousands of security contractors on the continent. In 2017, the PRC opened its first overseas military base in Djibouti, about 7 kilometers from the U.S. base in Camp Lemonnier. I'm concerned about the potential of a second Chinese base in Africa, especially on the Atlantic coast. In February, the PLA Navy conducted exercises with the South African and Russian navies along with South Africa's East Coast, and I introduced a resolution condemning these exercises and expressing my concern over the growing South Africa-PRC relationship. Ultimately, influence in Africa begins with setting a better example at home. Both on our shores and abroad, we must cooperate where we can and compete where we must. Furthermore, I'm incredibly worried about the CCP's effort to export its authoritarian governance model throughout the African continent. The success of this decades-long strategy can be seen with the votes of African countries in international organizations, which increasingly follow Beijing's direction. Yet polling consistently follows that Africans, particularly young Africans, want democratic governance. The United States must stand with the people of Africa and for the principles of freedom and rule of law as China seeks to define a future for Africa in its authoritarian image. The PRC's claims that they do not meddle in domestic affairs of African nations has been proven false. The CCP targets like-minded autocratic regimes and has funded numerous political training schools throughout the continent. Reports indicate that there are Chinese overseas police stations in nearly a dozen African countries. These buildings serve as regional hubs for the CCP's United Front Department, which uses coercive tactics to silence dissent against the CCP. For far too long, the United States has been complicit in these human rights abuses. We're even enabling them by leaning on the Chinese Communist Party-controlled mining in Africa. We will never atone for the sins of slavery, but a step in the right direction is purging our supply chains of slave labor, particularly in critical mineral mining and electric vehicle manufacturing. That starts by reshoring the minerals most essential to our national defense and our economy. A Green New Deal agenda built on the backs of black lives is worse than virtue signaling. It's evil. In closing, the United States must be a reliable and valued partner to many on the African continent, but more must be done to counter China's decades-long attempt to export its authoritarian government's model to the continent. Turning the tide of decades of failed foreign policies with each administration in the 21st century is not going to be an easy task. But as JFK said, this will not be finished in the first 100 days. But today marks the 101st of a Republican leadership in Congress. It's a new era. So, let us begin. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentle lady from California, Ms. Jacobs, for any statement she may have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I echo your sentiments regarding the World Food Program folks in Sudan and your call for civilian lives to be protected during the bloodshed. Today's hearing emphasizes the importance of renewed U.S. engagement in sub-Saharan Africa and how it compares to that of our competitors, with the People's Republic of China being the focus today. Africa has the youngest population in the world, and how we engage on the continent and with local communities will be remembered for decades to come. For too long, the African continent has been sidelined or neglected or seen as merely an aid beneficiary by leaders from the West, including by the United States. And it's incredibly important and long overdue that we correct this, and thankfully, the Biden administration has already taken important steps to do that and reimagine America's relationship in ways that avoid harmful patterns of colonialism. Last December, the Biden administration hosted the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit since 2014 to demonstrate our commitment to a new path forward with African countries. With this summit, the United States committed $55 billion to the African continent over the next 3 years in human capital, infrastructure, agriculture, health systems, and security investments. I particularly want to commend U.S. support for the African Union's bid to join the G20 as a permanent member and for UN Security Council reform to include an African permanent member, ensuring African states have a representative seat at the table where they are directly impacted by the decisions being made on the global stage. During the summit and the rollout of the Biden administration's U.S. strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, President Biden has emphasized that renewed U.S. engagement with the continent is not just through the lens of competition, that Africa is not just a pawn in a broader geopolitical game. Secretary Blinken has also made this clear, saying that the United States will not dictate Africa's choices, neither should anyone else. While we engage in strategic competition with the PRC on the global stage, we need to be mindful of lessons from the Cold War that unfortunately put African governments and populations in the crosshairs and caused immense suffering as we aligned with governments and militaries in pursuit of short-term security gains. Instead, we need to focus on the long-term impact of our engagement and ensure that we play a positive role in furthering progress on the continent, like addressing conflict, upholding human rights, strengthening good governance, and tackling global challenges together. Doing so helps protect other engagements like mobilizing increased trade and investment between the U.S. and African states. Another important part of increased U.S. engagement with African states is upping our game when it comes to our diplomatic engagement and presence on the continent. We have struggled for years to adequately staff up our embassies in the region, and it's critical now more than ever that we address this challenge so we can show up and engage where and when it matters. So I look forward to working with the Biden administration more on all of this. It is important to recognize China's increased engagement on the continent and where they are fulfilling a need that the United States isn't. But we shouldn't take everything China is doing as an inherent threat that needs to be countered one-to-one. If we do this, we can both create more space for cooperation with China so that our engagement doesn't spiral into greater conflict and allow a healthier version of competition on the continent that actually benefits African people and serves their interests. I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses today on the Biden administration's approach to these questions and how we can truly prioritize the needs of African populations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. Ms. Amy Holman is Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bureau of African Affairs and the Department of State. Thank you for joining. Mr. Rick Waters is the China Coordinator and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for China and Taiwan at the Department of State. Thank you for joining. And Ms. Janine Davis is the Deputy Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Africa at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. Thank you for joining. I appreciate you all being here. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to just 5 minutes in order to allow for member questions and comments. I now recognize Ms. Holman for her opening statement.
Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs, distinguished members of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you for your bipartisan focus on Africa and our nation's approach to the People's Republic of China in Africa. Before we start, I'd like to say a few words about the situation in Sudan and thank the chairman for the moment of silence for our 3 lost colleagues. The Secretary of State spoke with both the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces commanders yesterday to underscore the need for an immediate ceasefire, to permit delivery of humanitarian assistance, enable the reunification of Sudanese families, and allow the international community in Khartoum to make sure its presence is secure. We have also spoken with regional leaders to encourage additional diplomatic efforts. Ensuring the safety of our diplomatic personnel and U.S. citizens remains our highest priority. Moving back to the subject of today's hearing. Our African policy is about Africa, not about the PRC. The United States is focused on building enduring partnerships with African nations with our diplomats engaged daily. Together, we advance shared priorities, including building an inclusive global economy, tackling the climate crisis, creating opportunities in clean energy, advancing democracy, promoting respect for human rights around the world, and building lasting peace and security. We work to improve African options, not limit them. We strengthen local capacity and work with our partners to promote economic growth that is sustainable and inclusive over the long term. We partner with African nations to reinforce environmental standards, protect workers' rights, combat trafficking in persons, and support anti-corruption measures. We work with all sectors of African society to build strong institutions, champion democracy, and promote respect for human rights. At the same time, we recognize the serious challenges the PRC presents in Africa. We counter the PRC's attempts to project military power from Africa. We are concerned by the unsustainable levels of debt throughout the continent and increasing risks of debt distress. We work to counter Beijing's information manipulation efforts in Africa, to amplify its narratives, and to suppress voices it deems critical of the PRC or the CCP. These practices threaten the integrity of open and vibrant media ecosystems across Africa. The U.S.-African Leaders Summit last year and follow-on high-level visits to the continent this year demonstrate how seriously the administration views our relationship with Africa. The PRC is a strategic global competitor. We push back on corrupt or coercive practices that undermine our shared interests while offering alternatives in collaboration with our partners. We ask that everyone play by the same set of rules. We want to ensure all countries make their own choices. In conclusion, bipartisan action is critical. With this subcommittee and with your colleagues across Capitol Hill, we are confident that we can deepen U.S.-African partnerships, raise awareness of the PRC's corrupt and coercive practices in Africa, counter those practices, and advance our country's national interests. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Holman. I now recognize Mr. Waters for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Jacobs, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The chairman stole most of my comments, so I'll be very brief. I would say two broad things. One is that all of you are familiar with our China strategy. The PRC is the only competitor with the means and the intent to reshape the international order. Our policy response is premised on three broad concepts. One is to invest in ourselves, in the sources of our domestic strength, and in our democracy. Two, to align with our allies and partners in an effort to find common purpose and to shape the strategic environment around China. And three, to manage our relationship with the PRC in a responsible way, acknowledging that it is a fundamentally competitive and at times adversarial relationship. I head the Office of China Coordination, which our secretary stood up last December to harmonize efforts across the State Department to help prioritize and better coordinate our response to some of the challenges that the chairman and the ranking member laid out. I would highlight in the sub-Saharan African context 5 broad areas. The first is the issue of the rules-based international order, a seemingly esoteric concept that is quite important, I think, to everything from the norms and standards that our companies and our workers face to the very norms of sovereignty that uphold the international system. And sub-Saharan Africa has nearly a quarter of the votes in the UN General Assembly. You acknowledged, Mr. Chairman, the robust diplomacy the Chinese have engaged in. We counted at least 120 senior-level visits in 15 years. We believe the PRC continues to promote its national initiatives, its own concepts in this area, like the Global Security and Global Development Initiative, with the goal of reshaping this rules-based international order on terms favorable to Beijing. Second, in the economic realm, there are a number of concerns ranging from critical mineral supply chains to non-transparent PRC lending practices to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. There are real infrastructure needs on the continent. We all acknowledge that. But the way in which these needs are met should be free from corruption and coercion. Third, technology. From a U.S. perspective, we support the free flow of ideas, digital connectivity, These are foundational bases of growth, and yet the PRC alternatives in areas such as 5G technology and smart cities often carries profound risks to national security, to countries' sovereignty, to privacy, and to basic human rights. Fourth, security. The chairman mentioned the PLA's first overseas base in Djibouti. We believe the PRC is pursuing additional facilities in Kenya, Seychelles, Tanzania, Angola, and potentially elsewhere along the Atlantic coastline. And we have made clear in our bilateral relations and in many of our pronouncements that a PRC military presence on the Atlantic coast of Africa would represent a threat to our national security. Finally, in the informational and influence realm, there are a number of things that we should talk about here, ranging from how the PRC is leveraging content sharing agreements, ownership agreements with African media outlets, exchange programs, and its own high-level engagements to shape and deliver a distorted message of the U.S. You also mentioned extraterritorial law enforcement, the challenge of police stations, and I would note yesterday we took a very resolute response to the one in New York through the Department of Justice's announcement of a number of indictments. So in these areas, I look forward to answering your questions together with my colleagues on our policy response, and thank you again for holding this hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Waters. I now recognize Ms. Davis for her opening statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman James, Ranking Member Jacobs, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today and for your sustained bipartisan commitment to Africa. As others have said, the increased presence of the People's Republic of China in Africa, it's clear. It's invested heavily both in terms of resources as well as diplomatic alliances. Today, China is Africa's largest trading partner. But such headlines only tell part of the story. The United States has long been a partner to Africa. USAID investments have lifted 700 people from extreme poverty since 1990, dramatically reduced deaths from HIV and malaria, stopped Ebola in its tracks, and helped the continent increase primary school enrollment at a rate greater than any region in the world. We invest in human capital. We provide opportunities and we expand democracies, amplifying African voices to choose their own priorities. I'd like to take this time to outline a few of the challenges PRC presents and what USAID is doing in response. The PRC's approach to development in Africa is in direct contrast to ours. While the PRC seeks to improve its own growth by using Africa as its frontier market, USAID invests in the long term, in food security, in health, in education, economic growth, and the environment. The PRC, we know, primarily offers loans for infrastructure. And no one disputes that infrastructure is much needed investment for Africa's growth. But the manner in which PRC loans are negotiated and their lack of transparency continues to raise our concerns. Many of the PRC's loan contracts have non-disclosure provisions that can lead to African public debt, sustainability concerns when PRC-funded projects fail to generate the promised economic returns. In the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the global economic downturn, climbing interest rates have brought many borrowers in Africa to economic distress. PRC loan provisions complicate the ability for borrower countries to negotiate with lenders and reach long-term economic sustainability. But our goal today is not to compare the U.S. to China. It's to underscore the U.S.'s enduring partnerships and continued investments in Africa, because these investments matter. They demonstrate a model of development that is empowering and that truly delivers for the people of Africa. Through continent-wide initiatives like you mentioned, Prosper Africa, as well as Power Africa, USAID is driving investment, trade, and structural changes that offer better alternatives to the PRC approach. As home to the world's largest free trade area and a young, technologically savvy population, Africa offers tremendous opportunities for prosperity on both sides of the Atlantic. Since launching Prosper Africa in June 2019, the US government has helped close 1,100 deals across 49 countries at an estimated value of $65 billion in two-way trade and investment. Prosper Africa has built a partner network of over 1,000 organizations, with nearly 500 more deals in the pipeline, valued at an estimated $25 billion. By 2025, Prosper Africa plans to invest $171 million to boost African exports and US investment by $2 billion. In addition, Power Africa promotes private sector trade and investment in the sub-Saharan electricity sector. Since its launch in 2013, USAID has focused on the importance of contract negotiations and provided one of the initial grants to the African Legal Support Facility, which helps countries strengthen their ability to negotiate contracts. It has built unparalleled trust with African governments and has enabled them to obtain favorable deals and more durable contracts. Power Africa helps African partner countries diversify supply and export markets, create pro-growth regulatory frameworks, and develop and join regional markets. Power Africa also helps an energy planning process that results in competitive, fair, and transparent procurements for energy infrastructure. We're not just focused on trade and energy. USAID is investing in people. Through Feed the Future and through our health and health systems, today PEPFAR supports life-saving antiretroviral treatment for over 20 million people in Africa compared to 50,000 in 2003. In conclusion, our world is at an inflection point. Africa is a major geopolitical and rising economic player, and our partnership is built on peace, cooperation, and individual dignity. Thank you for your continued support of USAID's work in Africa. We look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Davis. Right on time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And piggybacking on those comments, there's a lot to be proud of, but I'm going to start with you, Ms. Davis. You mentioned PEPFAR and Prosper and Power, and those all phenomenal investments, and we look to reauthorize, redouble, and reassert our commitment to those. But for right now, I'd like to ask you about AGOA, the African Growth Opportunity Act. In 2000, that's a trade preferential program that we use to increase exports from the continent to the United States. In 2022, a third of total U.S. imports from Africa were through this program, massive. However, the total value of AGOA trade has decreased from a peak of a little bit over $56 billion in 2008 down to about $6 billion in 2021. As we look forward to reauthorizing AGOA, can you describe some of the technical assistance that USAID provides specifically for AGOA implementation, as well as for trade capacity building funding efforts through Africa more generally?
Thank you for the question and for the recognition of AGOA. I'll defer to my colleagues at USTR, the U.S. Office of U.S. Trade Representative, to comment specifically on the AGOA reauthorization, as they're the USG lead on that reauthorization. But your question around technical assistance that USAID is providing, our trade and investment programs have been the primary platform for two-way trade for over 2 decades, including through AGOA. And as you recognize, that volume has increased substantially. It's grown by 25% from 2000 to 2019. Our technical assistance, looking at both the value as well as the volume of that growth, is really working with partner governments to help them develop their national implementation strategies. And to expand those such strategies, we also build capacities within key ministries within African countries at the border crossings as well as at critical supports.
Where are the gaps and how we can do and how can we do better?
Sure. Some of the places where we can do better right now, that's an area of focus, is really looking at the challenges that we see countries having with AGOA procedures and regulations, accessing new sources of capital, connecting with US buyers and investments. Those are three of the key areas that we're focused on primarily right now to continue to grow that volume and value that you mentioned.
Thank you. For Ms. Holman, the Belt and Road Initiative has leveraged China's competitive advantage in sectors like construction services to increase its economic footprint in Africa. Why hasn't Africa participated in the supply chain initiative, given the threats to competitive system of global trade and its opportunities for U.S. businesses to grow? What are the primary hurdles for these U.S.-based companies to conduct additional business on the continent, and how can we help?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that question. There are considerable hurdles for U.S. businesses being interested in Africa. This is an area that I have invested considerable amounts of time in episodically over the past 10 to 15 years. U.S. companies tend to trade where the terrain is most familiar, which would be, first of all, domestically, and then the NAFTA countries, Canada and Mexico. We have had, in conjunction with USAID, the Department of Commerce, and USTR, numerous events to encourage companies to invest in Africa. Our embassies are very committed to encouraging any companies that wish to trade or invest with Africa, and we were very encouraged by the oversubscribed U.S.-Africa Business Summit on day 2 of the African Leaders Summit, where U.S. companies inked some $15 billion worth of deals, and we are systematically following up on those deals as an interagency team to see that our companies get the best deals possible that they can, and that those deals come to fruition. We also work with African countries to make sure that there's a level playing field. As I said in my oral statement, we want everyone to play by the same set of rules, and that means encouraging U.S. companies and countries who want to receive them, for those countries to have a level playing field, and for the international financial institutions and our own U.S. government programs to encourage that level playing field. Thank you.
So basically everything. Thank you. Appreciate that. I now recognize Ranking Member Jacobs for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to fixing everything with you. Thank you to our witnesses for testifying again. So as a framing question for this conversation, I want to discuss the ways we can approach strategic competition on the continent in a responsible and healthy way, and how we avoid the unhealthy forms of competition. During the Cold War, the United States partnered with autocratic regimes in exchange for strategic alignment, spurring violence and increased civil war in the process. So as the Biden administration is engaging in competition with the PRC on the continent, I think it's incredibly important that we are doing so in a way that considers the lessons learned from the Cold War and prioritizes long-term interests like good governance, democracy, human rights. So Deputy Assistant Secretary Holman, Deputy Assistant Secretary Waters, how is the State Department thinking about these lessons and ensuring we're not engaging in this kind of unhealthy competition or race to the bottom?
Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs. Look, the lessons of history are not lost on us. I think part of the reason that we have spent much of the past few months reorganizing the way that we handle the issue of PRC strategic competition at the State Department is to bring together the resources in the building across the enterprise that have looked at similar challenges historically. And so I think, what you see behind me with Lauren, Charles, and Kendra, our team who are here, who do all of the real work, is a reflection of the fact that we are trying to approach strategic competition globally in a manner that is, I think, in accordance with what the spirit of what you're saying. Now, I'll defer to Amy about how we are prioritizing it within the sub-Saharan African region, but I will say that in terms of our overall approach, this is a competitive relationship. It does have adversarial dimensions, but when we talk about how we engage the Chinese, including with our allies and partners, we have put a premium on recognizing that there are still areas of competition or areas where interests align where we have to work together. Issues like food security, global climate change, macroeconomic stability is just a reality that we have to do that. And even in areas where the interests are adversarial, we are trying to keep channels open so that we can talk responsibly about our differences, because I do think that is what the American people and also our allies and partners expect of us.
Thank you, Ranking Member Jacobs, for that question. I think what we have been doing over the past 2 years is really building partnerships. If you look at what we said in the Africa strategy, if you look at how we designed and the work that went into designing the African Leaders Summit, where we did listening tours, we worked with the AU, who worked with another subset of countries. We worked very closely with the embassies here in Washington. We wanted to hear what the Africans want out of these partnerships. And I think that it's a two-way conversation, which I think is a big difference from what I read about during the Cold War, because I was around for it, but I wasn't part of government except for the very, very tiny little end piece. And what we heard from the Africans were a number of different concerns. One is peace and security. We see that concern playing out in Sudan today and in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We see with the inclusion of the African Business Summit is day number 2, that economics and building building a strong economic partnership is very important to them. They want to have choices. We don't want to make people choose. And then we have the whole basket of governance issues that dovetail with peace and security, that governments are very concerned about how to provide services to their people, particularly when they don't have peace and security throughout their country. So we've looked at different tools for that. The Global Fragility Act that was passed recently, we're very excited about that, about having long-term plans and long-term money so that everything isn't just done on an annual basis, so that we can make progress in all the areas that both you and the chairman of the committee highlighted. We also look at the basket of climate and environmental issues, which are equally important to the Africans. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes Congressman Mills for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys being here today to answer a couple of these questions. I'm going to get to them quickly. How is the minerals security partnership working in countries like the DRC? And what is being done to support Congolese partners to increase economical security, increase economic diversification, and end exploitation by opportunists?
I guess that one's mine. Thank you, Representative Mills, for that question. I spend a lot of my time trying to figure out exactly how to address those concerns. On the Mineral Security Partnership, we are always looking for the kinds of projects throughout sub-Saharan Africa, in fact, throughout the world, that will respond to the governance criteria that are inherent in this partnership. In order for a project to qualify, there must be a number a number of conditions: responsible stewardship of the natural environment, a consultative and participatory process with local communities, and safe, fair, inclusive, and ethical working conditions. And at this time, although we do look for opportunities, and Amos Hochstein is heading up our efforts in that category, we haven't found a project that has brought all of these qualifications together. We continue to look, we continue to work. We continue to work very actively with the government of the Democratic Republic of Congo to improve its business climate. We understand that they are working to using the Millennial Challenge Corporation criteria as a guideline to guide their efforts to move forward so that we can establish the kind of business environment that will make U.S. companies want to go in and take advantage of the considerable opportunities that exist in the DRC, both in the mining sector and outside the mining sector. This is an active part of administration activities, but it's difficult, and we haven't seen fruits. We do have mineral security partnerships in Angola, Malawi, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda, as well as here in the United States and in Canada as well, in our efforts to break the PRC domination of supply chains in the kinds of minerals that we need to have a clean energy economy throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. And just following up on that, to also counter Chinese corruption and abuse, it is critical that elections later this year in the DRC are free and fair and on time. Credible democratic outcome in Zambia has led to a sea change has led to a sea change there. And in DRC, what is the State Department doing to ensure candidates are able to run without intimidation or interference?
Thank you very much for that question. When I'm not thinking about the conflict in the eastern DRC or how to get more economic opportunity, we're thinking on elections. The government of the DRC has already pledged that they will be doing elections on time. We continue to encourage them, along with our like-minded partners, to ensure that these elections are free, fair, and transparent, in addition to being on time, and we will be looking at the results very carefully. Our friends at USAID were able to act quickly early last year to provide almost $24 million in election assistance so that we could be able to disperse that election assistance in a timely manner. If we do it 2 months before the elections, it's not useful. And we really appreciate your interest and ongoing support in this area. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Mills. The chairman now recognizes Congressman Allred for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses for being here. I had the honor of being part of the presidential delegation to the inauguration of Kenyan President Ruto last September, led by our capable trade rep, Catherine Tai. And while I was there, I was struck by the desire for further engagement with us, but also I think some of the fatigue with some of the PRC's actions. And we've had a number of hearings on PRC activity around the world, but particularly in Africa. I think we have to always keep track of what I think you discussed in your testimony, Ms. Davis, regarding the strengths that we bring to the table, what we do far better than them. Obviously, there are things that engagements that we want to increase, but to remember basically who we are and that we want to be the best partner we can be, that yes, there's a competitive nature to it, Mr. Waters, but there's also, of course, a capacity building that I think is important and that only we can do really in a lot of ways. And that I think is, particularly when we met with Kenyan youth, that's the direction they want to go, right? And we also, of course, in December had there was a roundtable hosted by the trade rep on AGOA, and just for y'all's kind of information. There are trade ministers from pretty much every major country on the continent there, and they raised concerns with us helping us boost their productive capacity, complying with our food safety regulations, and decreasing utilization among smaller and less developed countries. I know that's not directly in your wheelhouse, but it is going to come to us in terms of reauthorizing AGOA. And I do think that the USAID has announced recently the Africa Localization Initiative to direct more funding to local organizations based in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was wondering, Deputy Assistant Administrator Davis, what the status of that is, of that initiative is, and why this locally led approach is so important for our strategy as you see it on the continent.
Thank you. I appreciate the question. So the localization initiative, there are currently 12 countries that are across sub-Saharan Africa that are part of the initiative. The current status, they've completed their strategic documents outlining their plans and efforts to expand those plans. We are also currently engaged in a budget exercise to realign, to identify additional resources to help support localization. We have a goal to establish a mechanism that allows us to provide increased capacity buildings in a more sustained way to allow these local organizations to do business with us directly. Finally, it's important to note that while there are 12 countries in this specific localization initiative, it's just one piece of our broader localization agenda, where across all of our countries, we are emphasizing the importance of identifying new and local partners to expand our work, and as you said, just capture what we do best on the continent. Thank you.
I think it's an exciting program. One of the issues that they continually raised, the trade ministers at the roundtable in December, was the trying to attract more foreign investment, attract American investment. And I noted to them in that discussion that stability and consistency are fundamental for attracting our investment. And I'm concerned with the state of democracy, of course, on the continent, and want to know and really see us do more to be helpful in improving conditions there. But only about 5% of our USAID and state-led assistance programs deal with democracy, human rights, and governance. And I'm wondering, Deputy Assistant Administrator Davis, if USAID has any plans for increasing the funding in that area, or for requesting more in that area, or focusing more on that area.
Thank you, Congressman. The simple answer is yes. So in the 2024 request for Africa, the request is $440.3 million, which is almost $170 million increase, 63% increase over our FY22 levels for democracy, human rights, and government and governance. We recognize the importance of that work, and as USAID continues to focus our messaging on democracy delivers and the criticality of that. So we will continue to work with you, with your support, to expand and deepen the impact of our democracy programs. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank Congressman Allred. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Waters, you mentioned the CCP and their overseas police stations, and how within 24 hours, cracked down on one in New York. That should be scary for everyone. The CCP has designs on everywhere in the globe, and dominating economically and from a military standpoint everywhere, not just in Africa, but in the United States of America. There are over 100 overseas police stations throughout the world, which uses coordinate tracking and harassing of PRC dissidents, what Beijing refers to as United Front work. Reports indicate that these stations exist in nearly a dozen countries throughout Africa, and again, most importantly, in our own country, on our own shores. 2 questions. 1, what is the department doing to expose and push back against these egregious infringement on national sovereignty, ourselves and our allies by the CCP? And question 2, is there any crosstalk between verticals, between departments to leverage lessons learned so that we can identify, define, and eliminate any threats to ourselves or allies?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I think this is one of the most important areas that we've been engaged on in the counter-influence realm. The Safeguard Defenders report that I think you're referencing, this report that came out last year, identifying a problem that we have long been aware of, the problem of transnational law enforcement within our borders, within the borders of dozens of countries, is an issue that we have been working to respond to in 2 ways. One is through our public diplomacy and through our private diplomatic channels. We have been engaged in a pretty extensive effort to share what we know and to develop the tools and response options that are most effective to this unique aspect of China's influence agenda. The second piece of our response really is in law enforcement channels, and there I'll defer to the Department of Justice, but I think in the statement they issued yesterday, the indictments against 44 Chinese nationals and a few others in New York, I think DOJ made clear that we will be resolute in responding to transnational law enforcement within our own borders.
Thank you, Mr. Waters. The chair now recognizes Congressman Jackson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman James. I've had the privilege of going to Kenya just the other week and went to the front lines to see the starvation that's going on in the camps that are now bordering Kenya, that are now, its recipients or the refugees are now coming into Kenya. So, for example, in that region, you've got Sudan, Somalia, Uganda, DRC, Ethiopia, all merging in on Kenya specifically. And I was hoping that we could be more specific when we're talking about the largest landmass in the world. So I'm just a little bit concerned about the generality of speaking of Africa and Africans as if they are a monolithic group. That I think in order to be more specific and to be more beneficial, we have to talk about what are our priorities and where are we going. But there are over 1,000 dialects of derivatives of the language of Swahili. There's French, there's Spanish, there's English. It seems like we need a room full of people to talk about the continent. The size, the Chinese are very specific on roads, initiatives, ports, initiative, mining initiatives, and somehow I feel as if we are talking down to the entire continent, as if we have to manage their affairs and not simply align ourselves with what their interests are and with their self-determination. One of the things I would like to know more about, if it's in your portfolio, is how the Forex market, the exchange rates are now crippling and deadening the markets. The Kenyan shilling was 115 to the dollar 90 days ago. Now it's 145 to the dollar, which has put the debt burden on them. They've lost 20% of their purchasing power because of actions from our Federal Reserve. I don't know which of you could address on how the capricious winds of our foreign exchange markets affect these developing countries and continually make them reset their economies. Well, I wouldn't expect, but maybe another time, but that is something to consider. The Kenyan economy is 3 trillion shillings, and now they are spending 300 billion in their shillings, and they've lost 20% purchasing power because of being connected to the dollar. But I think in our context, we should make that clear that these countries are emerging and what exactly is our deal. Another deal specifically in Kenya is that the last time I was there was 6 years ago, and there's a road that goes from the airport in Mombasa, in Nairobi, to downtown. I would have to leave 2 hours in advance to get to the airport. I was into the airport in 15 minutes, and that specifically was built by the Chinese, but it wasn't indebtedness. It was a build, operate, and transfer after 25-year agreement. So I think we should also let members know that the Chinese are coming in with some creative financing, that some of their projects are not adding to indebtedness, and they are building, operating, and transferring it over as a matter of practice. And lastly, on that point, Chairman James, is the contract was let for Nairobi to Mombasa, a road project to U.S. contractors that we've had for 10 years and haven't executed on it, which is one of the most heavily trafficked roads in the entire world, that we need to figure out how do we execute and not conversate with African nations. They are open for business, and they are rational people, and they're working with people that are shovel-ready, finance-ready, that don't have the legacy of colonialization in Africa, that want to go forward. So that was a comment.
Thank you, Representative, for your comment, for your thoughtful comments. On the Kenyan economic situation, we will need to take that back. Although I've also had the very positive experience of the new Chinese roadway in downtown Nairobi. The status of the Mombasa-Nairobi road and whether a U.S. contractor has been able to execute a contract, I'll need to take that back. But thank you for your thoughtful comments.
The chairman now recognizes Congresswoman Sherfless McCormick for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Recently, I traveled with the Vice President Kamala Harris to Ghana during her trip to Africa, to the African continent earlier this month. And during that trip, she made several historic commitments and announced further U.S. investments and partnerships. One of the announcements included the intent to invest more than $100 million to support conflict prevention efforts in coastal West Africa through the Global Fragility Act. The assistance includes programs to help strengthen economic development and increase governance and resilience in at-risk neighborhoods. In addition to that, we talked about Ghana's inability to pay back that loan and restructuring. So my real question is, how are we positioning ourselves to be good neighbors and help the Western African nations become more sustainable instead of the loans that China is providing, which actually causes a dependency? So Deputy Assistant Administrator Davis, could you please discuss the strategic importance of making these investments now?
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. I just most recently came back as mission director in Ghana, so I appreciate the context of the question. I think the importance and the urgency of making these investments under Global Fragility Act, under our strategy to prevent conflict and promote stability, the urgency is now, not only because of the continued spread in violent extremism, but as you're saying, this is a moment where our country government, the African country governments, are seeking out increased opportunity. They recognize that addressing these issues will require an integrated approach, as the Vice President highlighted, between defense, diplomacy, and development. And now that we have that agreement, it's our moment to build on it. So it's a strategic opportunity for us to provide transparent mechanisms for them to access these resources, and referring to the Congressman's statement, making sure that we allow our African partners to take the lead in defining their own needs and tailoring our offerings to the needs of those countries. Thank you.
Now, have we had an opportunity to have an implementation plan that would make sure that all of these dollars are actually invested? Because we have a lot of announcements, but when we look back to see the oversight, was it actually invested? How much of it was invested? Sometimes we fall short. So have we evolved to that state where we are looking at what's actually going to be invested in implementation?
Thank you, yes. So for particular to the Global Fragility Act, we just recently approved the 10-year implementation plans, which will define those specific investments. But again, it's also just important to acknowledge that this contributes to our broader portfolio and our overall oversight of making sure that our investments are put forward to their intended use. So we'll continue that process for all of our resources and apply them as we look at implementation of the Global Fragility Act.
And also, as we're looking at creating economic opportunities for the diaspora or African Americans in this country, or even Americans who want to participate, since it is a public-private partnership, is there a clear pathway for any entrepreneurs who would want to engage to gain an opportunity to participate?
Thank you, yes. USAID is working very closely to increase opportunities for U.S. Businesses. In particular, we are currently in the process of creating our diaspora strategy to make sure that we have a strategic, intentional approach to engage members of the African diaspora as well. So yes, it's an important part of our response.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. This question is for all of our witnesses. The American private sector is probably the single most potent tool that we must use in our competition in Africa with China. I represent the 10th Congressional District from Michigan, the #1 manufacturing district in America and the best district in the world. But we are hugely underutilized. What are state and USAID doing specifically to better incentivize and facilitate U.S. private sector involvement in Africa? Do our partners in Africa see the difference between Chinese state-owned enterprise standards and those provided by the U.S. and our allies?
Mr. Chairman, I'll mention a few thoughts at a global level on our China policy, and then I'll defer to my colleagues on the Africa-specific portion. The point you make, I think, is a very fundamental one, that ultimately we have a different model, as we know, one in which our greatest strengths are derived from the private sector, from manufacturing districts like your own. And I think that what we have seen of the Chinese overseas model is a reflection of state industrial policy, of a centrally driven approach through the Belt and Road Initiative that has, in many areas produced real infrastructure gains on the ground, but at a certain cost. And I do think that where we are trying to add competitiveness to our public-private sector partnerships is in areas like the President's Global Infrastructure Initiative, which was announced last year. This is a public-private, cooperative mobilization for which we're trying to mobilize $200 billion of the $600 billion commitment. We've also worked with many of your predecessors on improving the ability of our existing tools, the Development Finance Corporation, even smaller tools that may sound esoteric, but I think they do matter to the private sector here. The Transaction Advisory Fund, the International Transaction Advisory Network. These are tools that help third countries understand what high standards mean. And in some areas, these tools that we have put on the table are actually ways of facilitating private sector involvement. So again, these resources are in many cases available at a global level. But I'll defer to my colleagues on how specifically in the sub-Saharan African region we're trying to mobilize private sector development and support.
Thank you, Chairman. We are committed to our continued emphasis on public-private partnerships. And as we discussed, even during the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, the commitments that were made in the business fora, and following through on those commitments to build some of those partnerships. I'll recognize time, but just a few examples of what we've done most recently through Prosper Africa. Just over the past month, with Prosper Africa, we've announced 14 private sector investment partnerships in Kenya, valued at more than $150 million that was facilitated through Feed the Future, as well as Prosper Africa. We supported the close of a $274 million investment in partners with major financial institutions in the U.S. to include Bank of America, Briand Capital, Bank of New York, along with DFC. We also launched the Prosper Africa Tech for Trade Alliance that's looking at, through a partnership with major U.S. companies, focused on e-commerce and digital trade, and works with members such as Cargill, Google, MasterCard, Visa. So just some examples of what we've been working on over the past month. But broadly speaking, as Das Waters has mentioned, we're continuing to look at new and better ways to support that engagement and to respond to the needs of, to make sure that two-way trade and investment becomes a reality. Thank you.
I'd like to add a bit of a view from on the ground in Africa and how our U.S. embassies in many countries work to make U.S. company participation in those economies a reality. From 2019 to 2021, I was the Deputy Chief of Mission, the #2 at our embassy in Dakar, Senegal. Dakar is a bit of an interesting market. It's very, very emerging economy. It's francophone, so that there's an additional disincentive to some U.S. companies for coming in. But we spent 3 years to walk a $100 million electric transmission line installation deal over the finish line. We worked closely with the U.S. company, a small and medium company located in the Chicago, Illinois area. We worked with Exim to make sure that the government of Senegal got the flexibilities it needed. This took a lot of retail diplomacy, as I like to put it, with constant calls and interfaces with both the company, the government, and Exim back in Washington. We also worked with Bechtel to do a $4 billion road. That one is still underway because the government of Senegal would change the terms of the contract. They would not want to move as quickly as Bechtel was willing to work. We still thought it was a worthwhile process. It was a way for us to counter China because in many of these cases, from the embassy perspective on the ground, the major competitor is China. And even though And this has been a worry for us that just didn't start with the inauguration of the Biden administration. This is something that many of us have been watching over the past 5 to 10 years and figuring out how to use the resources of our export financing, the resources on the ground of our embassy with very committed people to see American companies ink deals and to put this out there. When Secretary Pompeo visited Senegal in 2020, and then again when Secretary Biden visited in 2021, we put economic opportunities for U.S. businesses very much at the center of the visit. We also supported, for example, WAVE, a small entrepreneurial U.S. sorry, it's allergy season, backed company.
Thank you, ma'am. Take a breath. We're a little bit over time.
Yeah.
The chairman would like to now recognize Congresswoman Kamlager-Dove for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually want to thank you for allowing me to participate in this hearing. I deeply appreciate it. And thank you to the witnesses here today. You know, I just have to share that I think for far too long, Africa has been an afterthought in U.S. foreign policy, seen through a reductive lens of security issues and humanitarian issues. And the United States has treated Africa as a region full of challenges and devoid of opportunities. But that has overlooked the reality, as has been stated, that Africa is the world's youngest, fastest growing continent, and it will play a major role in the shaping of the future. It probably is the future. Africa's growth opportunities, new markets, and political alliances carry enormous heft on the international stage, whether we acknowledge it or not. When Africa's influence was leveraged to advance PRC interests through the continent's voting power at the United Nations, its demand for infrastructure and communications technology, and its entrepreneurial youth population, the United States was left scrambling. It was our refusal to view African countries as mutually beneficial partners and our consequent inactivity in the region that created the vacuum for the PRC influence that we see today. You know, I think we have convinced ourselves that we are the most important partner to the continent of Africa, rather than acknowledging the reality that maybe our bargaining acumen is too pedestrian in 2023. So my question for Deputy Assistant Administrator Davis and Deputy Assistant Secretary Holman is if you can provide an update on the current status of the African Continental Free Trade Area, its implementation, and how state and U.S. aid are supporting our African partners in realizing this agreement.
Thank you. Thank you for the commentary. And I think, as we've discussed in the opening, with our new strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, really recognizing the importance of engaging Africa as partners. The AFTA partnership in particular, opening up, has created, again, continued opportunities for us to invest in Africa. We at USAID are working as to use AFTA to continue to improve those negotiated markets, as you've mentioned. And I think we're recognizing that it's another tool and opportunity for us to build on. I'll turn to my state colleagues to say more about the status.
And I'm going to ask that you keep your comments succinct.
Oh, we continue to watch the implementation of the free trade area. Again, this is a difficult area for many of our African partners to implement the very technical regulations that are involved in this. It will be a great boon for our companies to be able to trade across an entire area once it's implemented.
Thank you. I guess I'm just going to ask that we continue to get our act together as it relates to the kind of relationship we want to forge with the entire continent of Africa. You know, right now, 48% of the countries in Africa could be home to 90% of the world's poor by 2030, and 20% of the world's 38 countries that are in fragile, conflict-affected situations are on the continent of Africa. And we need to see all of the countries on that continent as potential partners rather than as pawns in a competitive game that we are playing with China. You can be competitive, you can be economically diplomatic, and you can recognize the history of the continent and a new kind of relationship we want to forge with the entire continent in order to reach goals that are mutually beneficial and that support self-determination and the actualization of the continent. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The chairman now recognizes Congressman Keene for 5 minutes.
I would first like to thank all of our witnesses for being here with us today and for the important work that they do. The CCP's involvement in Africa has become a testing ground for the export of its governance and economic models as part of the broader vision to rewrite global political norms. Mr. Waters and Ms. Holman, as American industry undergoes an energy transition in the coming decades, it is estimated that global demand for cobalt will increase more than 20-fold relative to 2020 levels. If tomorrow's economy will depend on cobalt, so will tomorrow's military. The mineral is essential for fighter jet components, precision munitions, stealth technology, and much, much more. It's my understanding that the Democratic Republic of Congo accounts for over 2/3 of global cobalt production, and that 15 of 19 cobalt-producing mines in the DRC are owned and operated by the Chinese. This Chinese monopoly is concerning both for the control it provides Beijing over supply chain integral to our economy and national security, and because of the gross human rights and child labor violations which occur in these Chinese-run mines. To combat these economic, human rights, and national security concerns, how would you recommend the U.S. consider or reconsider its approach to the Congo's cobalt and other rare earth minerals? And should they be viewed as strategic assets that need to be stockpiled as part of the reserve to secure U.S. access to in an emergency situation? What are your insights?
Thank you, Representative Keene, for that thoughtful commentary and questions. In terms of whether these minerals should be stockpiled, that's not really under the purview of the Bureau of African Affairs, so I would defer to other interagency colleagues on that. In terms of what we're seeing in the DRC, under the PGII initiative, we are looking for ways to diversify the cobalt supply chain. We're looking for cobalt mines that could possibly be acquired under, by either U.S. companies or by other like-minded partners. We recognize that this is a considerable concern for the reasons that you've raised. Thank you.
Also, Ms. Holman, as you're aware, this subcommittee has introduced legislation that calls out the African National Congress's corruption in South Africa and use of non-alignment to justify increasingly close ties with China and Russia, as seen in the war games conducted off the South African coast, all the while taking for granted the relationship with the United States. What is the Department of State doing to reinforce relations with our partners in South Africa and to deter future CCP and Russian engagement? And the conversation could be the question could be the entire panel regarding how are we working to deter Russian and Chinese engagement within the African continent.
Thank you for that question, Representative. On the South African, Chinese, Russian military exercises that were recently concluded, we share your concerns entirely and have expressed them to the government of South Africa. We had conducted military exercises with them in 2022, and we were quite troubled to see that these exercises were going forward. In terms of what we're doing to counter China and Russia, I think that was a question on the continent. We have we recognize that both countries represent a considerable risk to individual countries, to governance, and to, in certain cases, to the U.S. itself. So we have undertaken a number of efforts, whether it's basing, whether it's diversification of the critical mineral supply chain through partnerships and encouraging investment to counter these threats.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Keene. And the chairman now recognizes Congresswoman Sheriff McCormick.
Thank you so much, Chair. I just want to follow up with some questions. One of the announcements was the U.S.-Tanzania Bilateral Development Partnership, a 5-year, approximately $1.1 billion assistance agreement between USAID and the government of Tanzania to advance their development priorities. Once again, my question's for Deputy Assistant Administrator Davis. Why are investments like these strategically important for us? And also, is there any development with the implementation plan?
Thank you for the question. On the specific agreement with Tanzania, my team will have to get back to you to get a sense of the status. I think the second part of your question of why they're important goes to the core of a lot of our discussion today in terms of creating those opportunities and providing options and allowing the African countries to identify options that best meet their needs, such as the announcement in Tanzania. But we'll be happy to follow up to get that specific status for you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The chairman now recognizes Ms. Kim for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman James, for holding this very important hearing on CCP's influence on the Africa continent. And I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony and attending and answering all of our questions today. Chinese economic activity and investment throughout Africa has been directly linked to environmental degradation and has created public health emergencies throughout the continent. For example, since 2014, Ethiopia's Somali Ogaden region has seen thousands die from mysterious disease in the areas surrounding a Chinese government-linked natural gas plant, which has poisoned the drinking water supply. Coordinator Waters, can you please speak to how your department plans to hold China accountable for the negative impact of their investments in Africa and local communities, and how you will pressure PRC to abide by international environmental protection and labor laws?
Representative Kim, thank you for the question. This is a very complicated topic, and I think, at a general level, what I would say is that one element of our response to the challenge China presents in many domains is simply transparency. It's shining a spotlight on practices, whether they're related to corruption, environmental degradation. I will say that in this area, we face a very big challenge, to be honest. The Chinese spend billions on their influence efforts, on their informational activities. There are 30 Xinhua offices in the subcontinent. This year, despite having a domestic economy in China that has slowed, their foreign ministry budget increased by double digits, by 12%. And so while dollars are not the only measure of success, I do think that our strategy, first and foremost, is to shine a spotlight, to work with allies and partners, with
Right, which we're doing by obviously we're holding hearings and stuff, but I was hoping that you will give us more concrete 1, 2, 3 pressure points that you will keep China accountable. But let me follow up with maybe Deputy Assistant Secretary Holman and Deputy Assistant Administrator Davis. Maybe you can also speak to how your agencies are messaging the negative impacts of Chinese investment to our African partners, and what role should the United States play in delivering technical assistance to countries like Sub-Saharan Africa suffering from those negative impacts.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I can start. A lot of USAID's work is working directly with the host countries to build their ability to protect against some of the issues that you're describing, to report them, to engage community members, to increase awareness and report them. Some of the examples of the work that we're doing, we have a significant portfolio of anti-corruption activities. We have community hotlines, capacity building of local administrators, for example, working in mines, strengthening judiciaries, making sure that when these types of incidents are reported, that there's a system in country to be able to follow up and report on them. So a lot of USAID's work is working directly with the host countries on their national response when these issues occur, and encouraging the reporting of them when they
Sure. In the interest of time, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask just one more question to Ms. Davis. For the United States to truly compete with the PRC in Africa, I believe we must do more to incorporate American private sector into development assistance. So how does USAID's Africa Trade and Investment Program interact with Prosper Africa's deal teams, and how can this help facilitate greater AGOA utilization throughout the continent? As you know, AGOA has been termed as a very successful, tool.
Thank you. Very briefly, for the sake of time, I think the initiatives that you mentioned, the critical response to your question, is that interconnectivity. So our deal teams in country, our interagency deal teams, feed into identifying opportunities within each of their countries. They direct companies, both African as well as US companies, to initiatives that are supported by Prosper Africa. We work closely with DFC to link to support opportunities through AGOA. So it's that interconnectedness that reinforces our ability to increase private sector engagement. And again, just to mention our new commitments, that were made during the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit in the Business Forum to continue to build on those connections to reach those commitments.
Thank you very much, and I yield back the overtime.
Thank you. The chairman now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for one last question and comment. We all want clean air and clean water. We believe that's vital to life and thriving, not just here, but all over the world. Ms. Holman, you mentioned we want to increase choices for African nations to have more choices, not less. Ms. Davis, you mentioned that African nations should be allowed to make investments as they see fit according to their needs. These are all things, clean air, clean water, making investments according to their needs and having self-determination. Sub-Saharan does not mean subhuman, and we should not treat anyone as such. And so dictating and deciding what another nation's policy should be in this area is something I find interesting with the what seems like gaslighting nations in Africa with this administration's current strategy of pursuing greenhouse gas counting, despite the continent, the whole continent, being responsible for a fraction of historic and current emissions. When we talk about progress, we talk about prosperity, we talk about power. Can you speak to why a one-size-fits-all first world strategy fits Africa and their self-determination as many nations on a large continent, a quarter of the world's population, to get out of poverty without proven low-cost available energy sources like natural gas, which we could export to boost Americans' economy, cleaner, safer, with American union labor? Can we explain why we would not use an all-of-the-above energy approach to help Africa become a greater and stronger partner to the United States and to the world?
Thank you, Chairman. I'll begin. I first want to comment that, particular to Power Africa, we are using an energy mix. We create country strategies that apply to country-specific energy programming. We look project by project, country by country, and more and more, we are seeing African requests for more renewable energy options. But that is not to say that we don't continue to provide a large array of energy sources through our Power Africa activities. It includes solar and wind and hydro as addition to natural gas. You also mentioned in particular the greenhouse gas question, which is also important. And the climate resilience that you described is a shared objective of our African partners. And
is it a barrier? Is it a barrier to inclusivity across the continent? And is it a barrier to our partnership with African nations?
The concern that we have with the discussions around greenhouse gas is that 17 of the 20 most climate vulnerable countries are in Africa. So it's a vulnerability for them that we can't ignore in our discussions when we have these conversations.
Yes, but the largest contributors currently, China, for one, permitting 2 coal plants per week. If we can hold African nations accountable for greenhouse gas emissions that they have not even emitted and fail to hold competitors like China and allies like India accountable as we in the West are pushing toward a green future, building our green future on the backs of black slaves in artisanal mines in the DRC, then it's the height of hypocrisy. I would challenge the administration to look hard at balancing its agenda with the human rights implications that it has. and to work within the realm of reality to make sure that we provide, I love your term, energy mix to allow African nations the self-determination that they not only require and deserve, but are entitled to. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we'll ask for you to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to the committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit these statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length of limitations. Without objections, the committee stands adjourned.